Now let's look at other ideas white could have on the third move. White, for example, could play d4. And as a rule of thumb, whenever white plays d4 and he has not played c3 before, we should take on d4. If we do not take on d4, white might play d5. And we would be forced to play a Benoni position, which is not to everyone's taste. So c takes d4. And now white has two options. He can either take with the queen on d4, or he can play a delayed Mora gambit with d3. Let's start with queen takes d4. White is hitting the rook on h8, and we are forced to play knight f6, of course. But before I explain this variation, I would like to show you one line of the accelerated dragon to illustrate a point why this particular line is so advantageous for black compared to the hyper-accelerated dragon. So let's go back. After e4, c5, knight f3, the hyper-accelerated dragon starts with g6, and it is usually considered to be a good idea for white to play d4 in this line and capture with the queen, also hitting the rook on h8. Then we would play, of course, knight f6 to stop the attack on the rook on h8, and we reach a similar position, except for the fact that the knight is on f3 and the pawn is on a2, compared to the other position where the knight is on g1 and the pawn is already on a3. And this position is considered to be pretty good for white, because he can play e5 and hit the knight. Here, knight c6 can be answered with queen a4. And as you can see, the pawn on e5 is protected by the knight on f3. So let's go back to queen takes d4, knight f6. Now the obvious question we have to ask is, what happens after e5? And here's the difference to the hyper-accelerated dragon. Because we can play knight c6 now, and we threaten the queen on d4, so the queen has to move. But the queen also has to cover the a5 square, because black could play queen a5 check on his next move, and then capture on e5. So white has not much of a choice. He also needs to protect the pawn on e5, of course. He has to cover a5, so he should probably play queen c3. Knight e4, which hits the queen again. White is not able to cover a5, and therefore black is winning a pawn. For example, queen e3, we just play queen a5 check, and on the next move we simply pick off the pawn on e5, and we are a pawn up. So the very good line against the hyper-accelerated dragon with e5 doesn't work in this situation. So let's go back to knight f6. Black in this position has the intention to go knight c6 next, and then hit the queen on d4, winning a tempo. If black can just execute this idea, then he will be fine. He will play probably knight c6, followed by d6, bishop g7, castle short, and play dragon setup with several tempi up. So white should try to stop knight c6 and play bishop to b5. So knight c6 can be answered with bishop takes c6. That's why we play a6. We threaten the bishop, and if the bishop now moves, for example to a4, we can play b5, and then we can go knight c6. So the only logical move for white is e5. Now if we move the knight, then white's concept would be working, so we have to take the bishop instead. And white has to take on f6, of course. Here we reach a position where we have two moves. We could play e6, and after that we could play the next move knight c6 probably. And we could argue that the pawn on f6 is rather weak and try to win it. Or we could play knight c6 and try to develop quickly. I suggest we play knight c6. Now the queen of white is hanging, and white has two moves basically. He can take on e7 or he can go queen e3. Let's look at queen e3. Now we play e6 and we are threatening to take on f6. And it's pretty hard for white to protect that pawn and try to develop. So there was one game where white played this line and he continued with knight c3. The idea, of course, is if black takes on f6, white is intending to take on b5. Here in this position, black can play a strong move, b4. Now, white cannot take because of the pin, the rook on a1. So white has to move the knight. And he has to move it in such a way that he does not lose f6. So went knight b5. Now queen takes f6 is not possible because of knight c7. But after b takes a3, queen a5 check, very strong move, forcing the knight to retreat to c3. Black could play bishop c5. And this leads to a double attack, because the queen has to move, and after bishop to d4, both the knight on c3 and also the pawn on f6 are hanging, and as soon as the knight on c3 is defended with a move like knight e2, black can just pick up the pawn on f6 and there's a pawn up. So this is not a good line for white. Instead, after knight c6, white might take on e7. Now, white is attacking the queen on d8 and the rook on h8. So black is basically forced to take on e7 with a queen and give a check. White is also forced now to move the queen to e3 because it is attacked, so plays queen e3. And now we can take on e3 and play bishop to g7. The idea here is that we help white to develop, that's true, but at the same time it makes it a little bit awkward for white to protect the pawn on b2. So knight c3 can, for example, be answered with b4 in this position. So white will most likely be forced to play the move c3. And we can continue with knight e5. Now, this is the position we need to evaluate. Black has the bishop pair, especially the strong bishop on c8, which can be activated with moves like d6 later and then bishop to f5 or bishop to e6. And white, on the other hand, is in a pretty bad shape when it comes to light squares. They are all basically weak. As a matter of fact, black at this moment is threatening to play knight d3 check and pick up the pawn on b2. Also, knight c4 is an option. But the drawback for black, of course, in this position are the double pawns in the b file. Pawn on b5 and b7. But overall, I think the advantages of the bishop pair and the weak white squares give black more than enough compensation for his doubled b-pawns, and black should be better in this position. So the fourth move, queen takes d4, should not be a problem, which means we should go back to c takes d4 and look at the fourth move, c3. In this case, white plays some kind of delayed Mora gambit, and usually I would not suggest to take a pawn on c3 and accept the Mora gambit, but in this case g6 gives us a tempo which we need to develop the rest of our pieces. So it is possible to take on c3. So d takes c3, knight takes c3, and we of course play bishop to g7. Now white plays the usual setup with bishop c4 and knight f3. And here after bishop c4, knight c6, knight f3, the difference to the Mora gambit is that we can play knight f6 at this point. Now usually in the Mora gambit, white can try to refute knight f6 by playing e5. So this is the obvious move we need to check first. After e5, we play knight g4. Our threat is to take on e5 with the knight. So most likely white should take on f7 and try to play this little combination to win back his pawn. After bishop takes f7, we capture the bishop. Knight g5 check is forced. We go to g8. Now queen d5 check or queen b3 check can be easily answered with e6. White has to capture on g4. And now the pawn on e5 is unprotected, so we take it. Now black is threatening to take on g4, so the queen has to retreat. Queen to d1. The idea is to play queen to d5 check, and if black plays e6, white might take on e6 with its knight, because the d-pawn is pinned. That's why black should play knight c6 now. And queen to d5 check can be now answered with e6, and white can no longer take on e6, because black can just recapture on e6 and the queen on d8 is protected. This means we need to evaluate this position. Black is a pawn up and he has the bishop pair, especially the bishop on c8. But his king is a little bit misplaced on g8, so black will probably later play h6, driving away the knight from g5 and playing king h7. So temporarily the king is a little bit misplaced on g8, but it will find a nice home on h7. And then black can continue using his pawn and the bishop pair, and it should be clearly better in this position. Which means after knight g4, bishop takes f7 is not a good idea, and instead white should probably try bishop f4. After bishop f4, we need to capture on e5. Because if black does not capture on e5 immediately, white will just play queen to e2 and protect the pawn on e5, then play h3 and kick the knight on g4 back. After that, he can bring his rook to d1 and the d7 pawn might get under pressure. So black should capture now on e5 with this knight. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5. Of course, now if white moves the bishop on c4, he will just be down 2 pawns after castling short from black. So he has to take on e5 with this bishop. Bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5. Now queen to d5 is of course no problem, because we can take on c3 with check and then castle. So white should play bishop takes f7 check. And if we take on f7, white might play queen to d5 check and the king gets into trouble. So we should just play king f8. Now we need to evaluate this position. The king is a little bit misplaced on f8, but it finds a good square on g7. Beside that, black is up a pawn and has the bishop pair. So black should be clearly better in this position. This means that e5 after knight f6 is not a problem. White could also play h3 on his 8th move, with the idea to stop knight g4 and threaten e5. But black can simply play d6 and stop e5, and after castling short, black can continue with moves like a6 and then b5, bring the bishop to b7, and the queen on d8 is a little bit awkward placed, but it should not be enough compensation for white. Therefore, black should be a little bit better with his pawn up. This concludes the analysis on the 3rd move d4.